I'm accepting the challenge on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and if you'd like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques, then be sure and subscribe down below and click that little bell icon so you can catch future videos. Recently, I received a challenge from a YouTube friend who would prefer to remain anonymous. This challenge is, in essence, a contest where he took a set of 4 covered hoppers. He sent 2 to myself and 2 to my friend Eric Hall at imrro.com. He asked us to do with them what we would, weather them, detail them, decal them, whatever we would prefer, and he and some other YouTube friends are going to decide the winner. The winner receives all 4 covered hoppers. Well, I thought this sounded like a fun challenge, so I accepted and I was excited to get started on these covered hoppers. Now, my friend Eric, he's a good model railroader, but he's kind of an operations guy. Not sure how much he does with weathering and detailing, so I'm pretty sure I got this in the bag. But I wanted to show you exactly what I did with these covered hoppers, and we're going to start right now. Let's head on over to the workbench, and I'll show you exactly what we did. Be sure to take a moment to check out our sponsor, Midwest Model Railroad, where you will find a great line of model railroad equipment and supplies, as well as some of the best customer service in the business. They have a real-time inventory system that means what you see on the website is what you get, and they ship within 1 business day. Be sure and check them out at midwestmodelrr.com or follow the link in the description below. This challenge begins with 2 covered hoppers from a set of 4 special run cars by Pacific Western Rail Systems. These are Microtrains hoppers that have been custom lettered and lightly weathered. Eric will be working with the other 2 hoppers from this set. We were given complete latitude as to what we wanted to do with these cars, being challenged simply to do something with them. Upon opening these models, I found them to be nicely detailed per expectation from Microtrains, and the lettering was crisp and legible. The factory weathering was fairly light, mostly consisting of some grime along the sills on the bottom of the car. The models did have plastic wheel sets and truck-mounted couplers. My first step was to disassemble the car as much as possible so I could work on them. I removed the trucks from the bolsters and the wheel sets from the trucks. The roof hatches were separately applied details, so I removed them as well. As I considered what to do with these models, I came across this image of a Chicago and Northwestern car in the same 175XXX series. It's not exactly like the cars I'm working with, but it's very close, and I like the weathering patterns, so I decided to use it as inspiration for my work. I decided to use these covered hoppers to tell a story about a graffiti artist who is also a fan of model railroad YouTube videos, and thus tagged these 2 cars for his 2 favorite YouTube channels, imrro.com and Ron's Trains and Things. This being my plan, my first step was to figure out how to create some custom graffiti. After doing a little research and some experimentation, I decided to start with a phone app called Graffiti Name Creator by Creative Apps Factory. You can find this for Android in the Google Play Store. I'm not sure if it's available for iPhone or not. You'll have to check that out. I created the graffiti on my phone, then downloaded it to my computer and removed the background. I then brought it into Microsoft Publisher to size and to print the decals onto decal paper. When the decals had been printed, I sealed them with 3 coats of Testor's Decal Bonder. When dry, these were ready for use. The process of making these decals is a whole project of itself, so I will show you exactly how I created and printed them in a subsequent video. If that video has been published, you'll see a link to it in an iCard in the upper right-hand corner of your screen right now. I applied a base coat of weathering to the cars before installing the decal. I wanted this coat to represent some general grime and light rust, So I used a combination of raw sienna artist oil and burnt sienna gouache mixed together with a few drops of microsol for a general grime coat. I learned this particular combination of paints from Ralph Renzetti, and it produces an excellent grime coat. I mixed the colors together in a mixing palette, wetting my brush with some microsol as I went until I achieved the color that I wanted. Then, working on one side at a time, I completely covered the model with the paint. I was not at all concerned at this point about brush strokes or coverage. I just wanted to cover the side of the car. With the paint applied, I used the small end of a makeup applicator wedge, tore off some bits from the end of the sponge in order to make an uneven surface. I then used the small amount of turpenoid on the sponge, squeezing out the excess until the sponge was barely damp. I used this to blot up the paint and begin to remove the excess from the car, leaving only the amount of general grime that I wanted. Again, this is only the first layer of weathering for these cars, so I didn't want to leave too much grime at this point. I used a stiff bristled brush to dab at some of the detail recesses that the sponge couldn't get into. This side of the car needs to dry completely before turning the car over to work on the other side. With artist oils applied in such a light coat, this takes about 24 hours. You can speed up the process a bit by using a hair dryer on medium heat. While the first side dried, I worked on the roofs in much the same way. I tried not to get too much of the grime on the roof walks, as I'll be weathering them with a different process later. I added grime to the ends and slope sheets similarly, working with a small brush as the sponge couldn't reach into the recesses of the ends. I weathered the protected recesses of the ends more lightly as they're not as exposed to rain and other weathering. When the base grime had fully dried, I applied a coat of Tester's Gloss Coat from a rattle can just to the sides where the decals will be applied. This will give the decals a glossy, smooth surface to adhere to and will help protect against silvering. Just a single fast pass with a rattle can is enough. You can also use gloss coat with your airbrush if you prefer. I cut the decals from the sheet with scissors and then used a brand new sharp number 11 blade in my hobby knife to cut as close as possible around each decal to remove all of the excess decal film. I had printed the decals on a gray background to match the original car color to help mask any film that might get left behind. With the decals prepared, I soaked each one in water for several seconds. I applied some microset to the model surface and then used a micro brush to work the decal off of the backing paper and onto the model. I positioned the decal where I wanted it and used a clean makeup applicator sponge to remove some of the excess liquid from the decal. I used a Q-tip and an extra fine micro brush to conform the decal to the detail contours of the model. When I was satisfied with the placement and conformity of the decal, I used a separate brush to apply a layer of microsol, which softens the decal and helps it fully conform to the details of the model. At this point, you do not want to touch the decal until it is completely dry. I waited overnight before working on the decal on the other side of the model. When the decals had fully dried, I used my airbrush to apply a 50-50 mix of dull coat and lacquer thinner to the entire model. This takes the shine off of the model and gives the surface some tooth for the application of the remaining weathering. When the dull coat was dry, I used raw sienna and burnt sienna artist oils to create some general streaking rust. I mixed the colors together until I achieved a color that I liked, using my reference photo as a guide. I used a small brush to apply spots of this color in areas where the thinning paint would reveal rust streaks. I then used a flat brush, dipped it into a bit of turpenoid, brushed off the excess on a paper towel, then used the damp brush to pull the paint down the side of the model to create streaking rust. It's important for all of these streaking techniques that you pull the brush straight down the side of the model, as crooked streaks will leave an unrealistic look. Again, I worked on one side of the models at a time and allowed it to dry completely before working on the other side. When that layer of oils had dried completely, I used a burnt umber artist oil to create the effect of chip paint and rust streaks that result. I used a very small brush to apply the paint in spots where the chipping would occur. I concentrated on the widest part of the curve of the sides where the car is most likely to rub or bump against things. I allowed these paint spots to dry for just a few minutes, then used a brush dampened with turpenoid again to drag the rust streaks down from the chips. Clean your brush regularly when you do this to keep from transferring unwanted paint from one part of the model to the other. Be careful to leave the rust spots in place. If you accidentally drag too much of the paint away from a rust spot, simply reapply it at the top of the streaks. I do this with a piece of brass wire inserted into a scrap of balsa wood for a handle. I applied a few similar patches to the ends of the cars as well. On the roof, I applied the rust color to the roof hatch hinges and latches using the brass wire applicator. I softened some of these rust patches and created some streaks with the brush with turpenoid. For the roof hatches themselves, I stuck them to a piece of painter's tape on my workbench and weathered them with Monroe weathering powders. I'm simulating aluminum or fiberglass hatches, so there would be no rust on the hatches, but there would be road grime. I'm also simulating some hatches that have been replaced. I started with a grimy black powder to simulate general grime. I then added bits of dark earth and dirty yellow to add variety and light weathering to the newer hatch covers. Finally, I used a microbrush to add a bit of artist oil rust to the hinges. For the trucks, I put them in a painting jig and covered the couplers with painter's tape. I painted the truck side frames with Rust-Oleum camouflage paint from a rattle can. I used camo dark brown. This paint sticks well to the plastic of the trucks where many other paints will not. When the paint had dried, I further weathered the trucks with Monroe weathering powders, grimy black and dark earth. I started with the black and scrubbed the pigment into the side frames with a stiff brush. I then added a bit of the brown in the same way. The final look that this gives to the general weathering of the trucks is quite convincing. I used a caliper to measure the axle length of the original wheel sets and chose the appropriate length of Fox Valley metal wheel sets to replace them with. I weathered the wheel faces of the wheel sets with Model Master's Railroad Tie Brown. This is a good representation of the combination of rust and road grime that weathers the wheels on rail cars, although you could add a bit more of a rusty color if you prefer. I simply use an extra fine microbrush to apply the paint to the wheel faces, being careful not to get paint on the end bearing of the axle, which would impact the performance of the wheel sets. Finally, it was time to reassemble the cars. I put the new wheel sets in the trucks, then reassembled the trucks to the car body with the original bolster pins. I then reinstalled the roof hatch covers, and with that, my models were complete. Here's a look at the finished models. I think the weathering came out looking pretty good, and the unique story they tell will be a fun addition to any layout. And here is a look at the other side of the models in a run-by at North Yard on my layout. Well, I am really pleased with the way these covered hoppers came out, and I hope some of the techniques that I've used today will help you as you weather, decal, graffiti, some rolling stock of your own. I know that you'll enjoy the procedures, and I know that you'll like the way that your cars come out. I hope you'll give them a try. I'm absolutely certain that these are going to be the winning covered hoppers in this little contest, and so I'm very, very glad to have been part of this challenge.
If you enjoyed Ron's contest video, here's a link to my predicted contest winning video right here. I know you'll enjoy it, so make sure you go check it out after Ron's video. And as always, Ron, stay frosty, my friend.
Thanks for that, Eric, but I'm pretty sure I got this wrapped up. Hey, before you go, be sure and check out the description down below. Check out my Amazon page, Amazon Pick of the Week, some great stuff that I know you'll be interested in, as well as my promo code for Micromark. It'll help save you 10% on regularly priced items at micromark.com. Tons of other great links in the description. Be sure and check that out before you go. And join me each Tuesday as I bring you more great model railroad videos, and I look forward to seeing you then.
Now, what am I supposed to do at the end of your videos? Pick up the coffee mug, fake drink, faint boredom, pick up the cell phone, and stop the video.
10, is it?